Workers unite nationwide. I'm sorry, workers unite nationwide to form political party and oppose Democrats. That's the title. And um, this one, do I have a banner made for this one? So let's go and make one. So Jimmy and Kshama. So this will be our warm up segment here before we get to some of the main stories here. So let's listen to this interview.
We have special guests with us. Kshama Sawant is a politician and an economist who has served on the Seattle City Council since 2014. She is a member of the Socialist Alternative, and she's the first and only member of the party to date to be elected to public office. She helped win, among other progressive policies, the $15 minimum wage for Seattle. And she has announced she will not seek re-election and instead will be focusing on building Workers Strike Back. That's a national movement intent on strengthening the working class. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. Now, please tell me more about the Workers Strike Back. Let's talk about that right off the top.
Yes, Workers Strike Back is an independent rank and file movement that is organizing in workplaces and on the streets against the bosses and their political servants. I mean, it's in the context of the historic cost of living crisis that tens of millions of Americans are facing. Many young people have only known economic insecurity, low wages, unaffordable housing that gets more unaffordable every time the landlord jacks up rent. And in fact, we get a sense of how much the bottom has fallen from under working people's lives. We know the total loss provoked by the pandemic was trillions of dollars, but that's not happened in a neutral world. At that same time, billionaires have added $5 trillion to their fortunes, and workers are falling further and further behind. And at the same time, there is huge anger among workers at this starkly unequal reality, and they want to fight back. We are seeing social movement after social movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen this recent wave of tremendously encouraging worker organizing. Strike levels have gone up. But at the same time, what's missing is effective strategies to be able to win what working people are fighting for, whether it's struggle in the workplace, new union formation, or social movements. And right now there's a vacuum of leadership. We saw what happened with the Roe v. Wade repeal. All these mass organizations that are tied to the Democratic establishment, they completely failed. And the Democratic establishment completely failed to stand up for abortion rights. And then in contrast, actually, we've seen progressives selling out working people. We saw the massively shameful debacle of the railroad workers, the strike-breaking votes that were taken by the Democrats as a whole. But let's be clear, by the entire Congressional Progressive Caucus headed by Pramila Jayapal and including the squad. So in this context, we need genuine ideas of how to build rank and file militancy, not only inside labor, but also in general. And that's what Workers Strike Back is all about.
So worker militancy, right? That seems like a phrase that would scare most Hillary Clinton voters or Joe Biden voters. Worker militancy. How do you sell that to enough people?
The reality is that a lot of the people who even may have voted for Hillary Clinton.
I think for me to answer this question, I don't think worker militancy is hard to sell. Because if you think militancy where you're not just gonna, roll over and you're gonna speak truth to power, I think a lot of workers would be down for that. See, the problem or one of the issues I see foresee, I don't see it maybe, yeah, it is an issue now. Foresee is that there's still people who are trying to say labor movement that is intertwined with the Democratic Party, and they want to be, it's about labor, but it's through or by the means of or via the Democratic Party. Then there's people who aren't in that sort of shade. So what's going to happen when that comes to a head? because the hijacking will be attempted. Don't think because she's trying to do some sort of, or we're trying to do some sort of labor building, that they're not going to try to hijack it. That's what they're doing, and that's what they've been doing. You see it with the rail strike too. But let's listen.
Actually are winnable to fighting ideas. But you know, they've never been exposed to them. There's no mass force that is providing these ideas, providing the leadership, and providing the experience of how to win. I mean, that's what's remarkable about our near decade. You know, when I leave office in December, I will have served on the city council for a decade. And you mentioned some of the victories we've won, and we've shown how it is actually possible to be a leading force, never sell out, always be principled, and yet not be marginalized, and build mass movements, fighting movements to win victories. But we don't have that example. In fact, unfortunately, it is not only the Democratic establishment and Democratic Party and progressive politicians, so-called progressive politicians. It's also much of the labor leadership. I mean, let's look at what's happened. You know, this apocalyptic scenario that is unfolding in East Palestine in Ohio with what happened with the railroads and with the railroad magnates, you know.
And she makes a point right here. And what I was just saying, why it's problematic to have people who are saying they're a labor movement, but they're in the Democratic Party. And she's making the point, where's the labor leadership out in East Palestine? You know why they're not there? Because what happened is tied to both parties. And the Democratic Party has the labor leadership mainly. So guess what they're not going to do? Do anything to bring light to the terrible Democratic Party. You see how that's problematic? So I get why the Nina Turners, the Jen Perlmans, the people who are still in the Democratic Party, workers, worker movement, there needs to be a labor movement. But this labor movement that's tied to the Democratic Party is not the labor movement that we're talking about. So with worker strike back, one of the tenets, I think is the fifth one, when you go on their demands, is no more sellouts. So no more of this type of teaming up with the Democratic Party.
Just trying to expand their profits and introducing concepts that basically are, let's make everything as crappy as we can get with. So let's make it crappy for railroad workers and for working class people. And let's take the maximum loot for billionaires, major shareholders, and top executives. And so in this situation, where is the labor leadership that should be fighting for the people in East Palestine and for railroad workers? That missing middle, that whole leadership on the left that's missing, that's what we need. And in fact, if we have that, I'm confident we will be able to win over millions of people.
So isn't that the problem with the left in America, that in other parts of the world, the left is directly connected with workers and the working class and unions? And in America, it's more of a liberal middle class thing, where the activists will be worried about how many people of color are on a board instead of working to get a living wage for people or health care for people, things that actually help the most black and brown people. They don't seem to be focused on that because the left movement isn't connected to workers or working class struggle. It's all about identity. Would you agree with that?
I think it is absolutely true that identity politics has been weaponized by not only by the ruling elite and certainly corporate bosses, but unfortunately also by many so-called leaders on the left. In fact, one of the reasons the victories that were won by the Black Lives Matter movement were not commensurate with the strength of the actual street protest movement was because many of the leaders really just sold out. They maybe made money for their own NGOs, and actually, in reality, in the name of identity politics, actually gains for black and brown people, working people, haven't been won. In fact, in Seattle, we saw when we were fighting for the Tax Amazon movement in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, some of these so-called leaders said they attacked our movement, saying, well, taxing big business for affordable housing is not a Black Lives Matter issue, which is a completely ludicrous thing to say, because it disproportionately, who is affected by evictions and by the skyrocketing rent? Obviously, it's all working class people, but disproportionately it is communities of color, the poorest people. And so we refused to accept their gatekeeping, and we went directly to the rank and file of the movement. And the movement was tremendously popular. In fact, we collected 30,000 signatures for the ballot initiative petition, which is precisely what forced the Democrats and big business to concede. And that's how we won the Amazon tax, on the strength of the support we got from the movement. And we have to push back. The left has to boldly push back against identity politics, and in fact prove ourselves as the best fighters both against different types of oppression, and do that while uniting the working class on a genuine working class program. That's why, for example, Workers Strike Back, our program, I invite people to look at workersstrikeback.org. What we are calling for is that workers need a real rate and at least $25 an hour. We're talking about good union jobs for all. We're also wanting to fight against racism, sexism, and all oppression. We want quality, affordable housing and free healthcare for all. And most importantly, no more sellouts. The working class needs a new party for ourselves.
So so she went over the 5. I think it was 5 she just mentioned. Yes, Medicare for all. Yeah, it's about 5 that she mentioned. Those are the ones that are on the website. We went over the website before. I don't need to go over it again, but it's like Workers Strike Back. Nick from RBN was invited to speak at the Seattle function, which is the biggest function. The what do they call it? The main function the main launch is being in Seattle. So they're flying him out to Seattle to do a speech at this launch. So very happy to hear and see that. So let's continue.
In the 60s, much of the second wave feminism was born in the peace movement, and women were tired of being treated as the ladies' auxiliary of the left. And you're fighting for free abortion for all. Why is it important that those of us outside the Democratic Party fight for women's reproductive freedom and not allow this issue to be monopolized by the pro-war liberal class?
I think it's very important that we don't allow it to be monopolized in this fake way by the so as you said, the so-called liberal class, which actually weaponizes the issue against working class people, and at the same time has completely failed to stand up for abortion right. At the same time, the left also has to fight against right populist ideas that also do their own divide and conquer by actually promoting dangerous ideas of sexism and racism. And in fact, if you look at the statistics throughout the country, what is happening is so many women who are in states that have banned abortion in different ways, they are actually having to travel multiple states. In fact, we're seeing article after article every day, moving situations of women who are having to travel multiple states just to get their basic rights met. And this is an issue for women in general. It's not that, if you have a right-wing position on some issue, you wouldn't need this. And in fact, that is why we should fight to help and educate people and help them understand that these are actually unifying issues, because human beings need these rights. Another glaring example, and it shows where the so-called leadership on the left has failed, including the squad, is the issue of Medicare for all. I mean, you've covered this on your show. A few others have talked about this. Courageous people have talked about this. Is the support for Medicare for all is across the so-called party lines. I mean, majority Republicans support Medicare for all, and majority of American working people support Medicare for all. And yet we don't have any semblance of leadership on the left that can fight against pharmaceutical corporations and insurance companies and the establishment politicians in Washington, D.C. to actually win this. That is why we will need to revive, as you were saying earlier, militancy, the rank and file militancy. And actually, it's not just European labor movements. Obviously, they made much more progress than in the United States, but the United States has its own proud militant labor tradition, and the way they were able to carry out the general strikes in the 30s that led to the New Deal. It wasn't FDR who gave that to us.
Right.
The way they won it was by uniting working class people on a big scale.
So Christian Smalls was the most recent big example of uniting across working class people, uniting along class lines. Now, I've said this many times on the show, most Joe Biden voters don't understand what that actually means. They'll say it. We need to organize along class lines. But when it comes to doing it, they don't do it. What Christian Smalls did was he organized with working class people at an Amazon fulfillment center on Staten Island. And if you know anything about the demographics of Staten Island, it's a bunch of white working class Trump voters. And so he organized with Trump voters across class lines. And when you tell Biden voters that, they don't want to do that. They don't want to have anything. They won't even join together to try to stop a nuclear war with people who vote for Trump. How do you get it through their heads what organizing really is? Organizing is about organizing around an issue, whether it be Medicare for all, whether it be war, whether it be living wage. And if you start to mix other things, you lessen your power. So how is your new workers strike back organization going to be able to fold all workers in of the same class who might be of a different political stripe?
I think, first of all, I think it is important to recognize that in terms of what you're saying, Biden voters, I think there are a lot of people who voted for Biden, and also the midterms are a good example. Actually, the midterm results, the Democrats did squeak by, and they didn't have the kind of annihilation that a lot of political commentators were predicting. Why? Not because the many young people who voted in record numbers in the midterms have some big rose-tinted glasses about Biden or Democrats. No, in fact, young people are, for the most part, really angry at both big business parties, and they're looking for something different. And the problem is that there's nothing else on offer. But the reason they voted for the Democrats was because they were angry at the right-wing attacks on abortion rights, angry at the conservative Supreme Court's ruling, Dobbs ruling. And so we should not mistake the votes that the Democrats get as actual support for them. In fact, it is really, it's a heartening thing that so many people in America are actually, the consciousness of many people is actually moving to the left, in fact, but there is no left leadership available. And so what you're seeing is this interesting phenomenon, and actually dangerous phenomenon, where while consciousness is moving to the left, and really there are more and more openings for mass struggle. In reality, because of the vacuum left by the absence of left leadership, there's also a growth in right populism. And so I think what we need is a real force that can pierce through these what actually may be superficial divisions and really push forward. And I don't want to exaggerate. We're not going to win over people who own mansions and vote for Biden enthusiastically and go to these gala fundraisers where $5,000 a plate or whatever for the Democratic establishment. Those are not the people we're trying to win over. Those are not our audience. We're talking about the mass of people, working people who are winnable. And it's not only the most low-income workers. In fact, just to give you a concrete example, just last week, my office was able to win what has turned out to be an extraordinarily historic victory, banning caste-based discrimination in Seattle. And one of the biggest forces fighting on our side are tech workers, who are much better paid than the average worker. And one of the most prominent unions that endorsed our fight was the Alphabet Workers Union, which is the union that represents Google workers. So there are examples, really real-life examples that show that we can successfully unite on a working class basis, as you're saying. And in fact, just one thing I'll mention is one of the first things actually that Workers Strike Back took on was the solidarity fight around a union drive that is going on at KCVG, which is the largest air hub of Amazon in the entire world, which is in Kentucky near the Cincinnati International Airport. And there, courageously, workers are organizing. They've built a strong organizing committee, but they're also under attack. The Guardian newspaper showed just this, I think yesterday, an article that actually corporations like Amazon are ramping up their attacks against union drives. And what we need is to highlight these efforts and bring solidarity. So, for example, in Amazon, we need to build solidarity between warehouse workers and tech workers, and it can be done, but we need that leadership.
Doing live stand-up comedy in Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Nashville, North.
So if you watched it live, I think I caught a little bit. If you watched it live, there was probably a little bit more in the interview, but that's where they cut it for their clip. So hopefully, if you watched it, hopefully you were able to watch it live to see a little bit more. It's not like it's a lot more, but maybe a tad more.